Hello, and welcome to Danielle's workshop, which is really just me talking to you about doing game design. I'm going to be doing this over the next 3 weeks, probably. I probably shouldn't be doing any more than that, but each week I'm going to be splitting up this kind of concept of design theory between three distinct parts. So those distinct parts are setting, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, mechanics, and then testing. And the reason I've split it up this way is because in general, I want to talk about game design in a holistic way. And I have a little bit of background for project management and planning. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to relate back to things that I've learned from like my husband, who is a software engineer. And so we talk a lot about how to run projects and how to design, how to think about a project as on a big level. And so when you talk about game design, it's not just what is a mechanic and how do I build a mechanic, but it's thinking about everything from, what am I going to make? What game is this? All the way to who is going to enjoy it? What are you looking to get out of the game? Those kind of things. So I've broken it down into what I'm calling setting, but what we're going to talk about today is more than just designing a setting. It's really about thinking about your game from the very beginning. And then next week we'll talk about assigning mechanics to those things. And then the week after that, we'll talk about testing and getting feedback and iterating and hopefully finishing that up into having a game. So tonight, I'm going to get started talking about what it is to design a game. And then hopefully towards the end, we'll have a little bit of time where I'm going to ask you, the viewers, to help me workshop the setting of a game using what we talk about. So there's going to be a lot of me just sitting in front of you talking for a little bit. So, if you have any questions while I'm talking, if I say something that you're interested in hearing more about, please just say something. I will try to make sure that I'm getting this back from you. There's a little bit of lag and delay, so if I don't see it immediately, I will try to get to it as much as fast as possible. Yes, I am the crunch dog. All right, but today I'm not talking about crunch. Today I'm talking about setting. All right, so let's start with the first thing you need to think about when you're designing a game is the top level. You need to plan what this game is. So to think about that, we're going to ask yourself this question: what kind of game are you making? This is a really good place to start and think about a big picture. So the big picture is your genre. What is this a game? Is this a sci-fi game? Is this a fantasy game? Like, those are really big decisions. But when you think about, or what kind of game are you making, you need to think about that kind of thing. So I often think about, what kind of game you're making. Usually people aren't just like, I want to make a fantasy game. Great, let's go. I mean, sometimes you do. Sometimes you say, instead, I want to make a D&D analog, or I want to make a fantasy game that people can punch monsters in the face, but also make out with them. I will probably use making out with characters a lot as examples because I like doing that in games. So bear with me. So on the high level, what kind of game are you making? And then the very next question you need to ask yourself is, what do people do in my game? So what kind of a game am I making? A sci-fi game. What do people do in my sci-fi game? And that's a really big question. And that is a question that I'm going to say, people don't often think about whenever they first start doing their game. When they first start making it, they're like, oh, I got this cool idea for this cool setting. Or I got this, like, let's you know, I have this entire world that I've built out in my brain and I want to run a game in it, or I saw this movie, it inspired me. They don't think to themselves or even say, hey, what are people going to be doing at the table? And when I say that, I'm thinking about a good example is Blades in the Dark. It's a heist game. People are going to be doing at the table. They're going to be planning and executing a heist. In fact, Blades in the Dark doesn't really do a whole lot about planning a heist. They're just going to be enacting a heist and then talking about their plans in like flashback scenes. So you really need to think about what you want to do at the table. And that can be something very specific, like Blades in the Dark is very specific. It runs heists. That's pretty much all it does. It could be something more broad. It could be, you know, an adventuring game in which you want people to be able to do social political stuff and combat stuff. But you have to think of a way to explain what people are doing at the table. And that should be part of a thing that you keep in mind the entire time you're designing, from setting to mechanics to feedback to everything else. This is going to be the most important question that you ever ask yourself about the game you're about to make. What do people do in my game? If you don't know that answer, you should stop designing whatever you're designing. You should ask yourself that question and you should answer it, and then you can continue. So sometimes that's a hard question to answer. It sounds simple, but it isn't so easy to answer. So there's some ways to help you answer this question that if you look at Onyx Path books, we do it a lot, where we'll talk about a mood and a theme. When you talk about the mood of a game, this is going to define the tone of the game. It's going to define a feeling that you want players to have while they're playing this game. If your mood is a Vampire the Masquerade or Vampire the Requiem game that's very, you know, kind of dark and broody, then you need to keep that in mind as you design the setting, as you design everything else. Because if you're a dark and broody or grim outlook style game and you've got mechanics for making friends, maybe that's not supporting that mood. But if you have a mood that is bright and sunny and about exploration and about wonder, and you have a bunch of mechanics about murdering people, maybe that's not upholding your mood either. So defining a mood for your game will help you in the long run to decide what kinds of rules and what kinds of design elements you want to add to your game. The next thing to think about is the themes. And themes and moods are like, I'm not going to try to define the difference because I know the difference, but I'm not a teacher. I'm not a literature teacher. So, but the themes of the game are also going to help you better define what your game is about. So, you know, what kind of themes are your characters exploring? Are we talking about a happy game where people are, looking for hope and finding hope within themselves as a theme? Are they exploring their world around them as a way to evoke wonder? Are they discovering lost ruins? These kind of themes are helping you define what people are doing at your table. They're really your crux of, but what really is this game about? You don't have to deeply define your mood and your themes, and you don't necessarily have to have more than one mood or theme, but I think the more that you create for your game, the better you're going to be able to really pinpoint and give a full picture of what you expect people to be doing when they're playing your game. So now that you kind of have an idea of the themes that you're going for and the mood that you want to evoke at the table, you should really set to setting. And your setting is going to define what people do at the table just as much as your moods and your themes are. Where you set your game, what kind of world you build around your game will help the players understand what your game is about. Now, you may find that a lot of games don't necessarily say out loud, this is what your game is about. This is what our game is about. This is what you do in the game. In fact, very few games say this in explicit writing. They use moods, they use themes, or they just give you the setting. And in that setting, there is implied action. So a game that does this a bunch is Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons doesn't tell you exactly what you're supposed to be doing in this game, but there's a lot of implication on what you should be doing in this game. It's an adventure game, it's an action game. You explore dungeons, you kill monsters, maybe even you kill dragons. But the game never says you are going to go on an adventure and kill some monsters in those many words. It tells you that in the setting that it's built around. It tells you that in the mechanics that it uses and the rules that it uses and the presentation. But it never, like, there's not a sentence that says, this is exactly what you're doing in this game. And that's okay. Some games are better at that. Again, Blades in the Dark, which I will probably use as an example a lot because it's a game that really knows what it wants to do. I will get to conflict in a minute, Golden, because you're right. So Blades in the Dark tells you what it wants you to do. It tells you up front at the very beginning, it says, this is a game about running heists, about being criminals and doing all sorts of criminal activities, going to jail, all these kind of things. And that is within the first third of the book. You don't even get to the setting until the end of the book. So everything in Blades in the Dark is about running heists. And so I use it a lot because it knows exactly what it wants you to do. And it's a very good job of telling you what you're going to be doing in this game. Another game that I like to point out that tells you kind of what you're going to do is Vampire the Requiem. This game tells you up front that you're going to be playing a game centered around personal horror. And then it creates a setting that is a pretty detailed setting around that idea of personal horror. All of your clans, all of your covenants that are represented in Vampire the Requiem give implications of the kinds of personal horror that you're going to run across in the game. And so these are these examples, but let me talk to you specifically about setting elements. So there's two types of setting elements, or two types of way to create a setting in your game. And one is an explicit setting, and the other is an implicit setting. And I'm going to talk about implicit setting first because it's kind of simple, and it's something that I can define pretty quickly and you'll understand what I'm talking about. An implicit setting is something where you don't actually have a setting chapter in the book. You don't delve into all of the lore or the background or what happened or what got us to this point. Instead, just the names of things or small game elements help define your setting without actually putting you any one place. Games like Monster Hearts, Apocalypse World, even base Dungeons and Dragons, it doesn't give you city names and lore and history of all these places. Instead, it tells you what the game is about, and it gives you the setting through the player character types. It gives you the setting through the rules. It's really easy to make an implicit setting to just say, okay, it's going to be like our world, and the mechanics that I present to you or the character options that I present to you will show you how it's different. But it's also easy to think that you're implying a setting and just not. So when you're doing implied setting, when you're trying to make a game that people could maybe drop anywhere, but that has some strong themes and moods, like Apocalypse World, then you should make sure that you're making some assumptions and that you define those assumptions. Even if you don't define them in the book, define them for yourself so that you don't weirdly change the direction that the game is going in halfway through because you don't have lore to tell you which way to go and which way not to go. And then when you think about this, if you're designing this on your own, that's easier to do. But again, you're not always designing by yourself. I collaborate with a team almost always. So if you're collaborating with a team and you're trying to do implicit setting, you should really, really, really line up your mood and your tone and your themes and get those concrete and set in stone before you ever start collaborating. Specifically, so you don't end up with, oh, well, the mood of Apocalypse World is supposed to be kind of this post-apocalyptic, pretty gritty world. So if you have hilariously funny item names, those don't really jive. So you should make sure that if you're collaborating, you make sure that these people understand the mood you're going for and the tone of the game. So even if you don't directly define those things in the game book itself. Next, we're going to talk about explicit setting. And explicit setting is what I think most people think about when I talk about setting. In explicit setting, games like all of the World of Darkness games, Exalted, the Forgotten Realms for D&D, these are all explicit settings. There's not just a mood or a theme plus a genre and some character options. There's city names, there's location names, there's a history, there's a lot of lore set into the world. It's going to give you key players, it's going to give you places you can explore, it's going to give you socio-political background. And a lot of people, when they're designing a game and they're thinking about setting, this is what they're thinking about. And again, when you're collaborating on explicit setting, you have to be a lot firmer in what is and is not part of the setting and what is and is not part of the lore. Here at Onyx Path, we create setting Bibles. We create long documents of information that may never even make it into the book, just so that we can ensure that everybody's on the same page about the information that they're writing about. If you're collaborating, it's really important that everybody's on the same page. It's important people talk to each other. And one of the things, I've collaborated with a bunch of different groups over time, and something that I would suggest, even if you're not collaborating, if you're building a setting, is to build an internal timeline. And when I say internal, I mean, I'll answer your question in a second. But when I say internal timeline, what I mean by that is it is a timeline of events for your setting. It's not necessarily one you're ever going to publish, but it is one that you can reference for your lore so that you don't get confused of when things happen. Set that stuff in stone. Don't try to do like, well, a couple of years ago this happened, and then previous to that this happened, but then after that this happened. Give it dates, even if you never give the reader those dates, because especially if you're collaborating, but even if you're not, like I can barely remember the things I wrote like 2 weeks ago. So if I create something and then a month later I'm writing about it and I forgot when in the timeline that happened, like just having a mapped out timeline is going to be so good for you. Now, you asked about the setting documents that are style guides in the Storyteller Vault. I think the style guides in Storyteller's Vault are a little more reader facing than we do for setting Bibles. But the setting Bibles are usually very really dry. Are very I wouldn't put a setting Bible in front of a reader. They're not polished. They're just kind of, this is what I want to see. These are the kind of things we're going for. This may be the history, but it's really rough. I don't actually have it read through all of the Storyteller's Vault style guides, but I'm willing to bet that those are a little more friendly to read. Not saying that our setting Bibles are crap or anything like that. It's just they're in for internal use only. So, but as far as them being similar, I think so. I think, the Storyteller's Vault is trying to give their content creators the ability to create content that fits in line with the settings of these different game lines. And so those design documents are kind of built to help guide you in the right direction. So, who was it? Golden mentioned that they were making a setting. It was a totally awesome setting, all about exploration. And then they realized that that's not fun without conflict. And that's super important. Conflict drives story. End of story. Conflict is necessary in your game. That conflict doesn't have to be combat. That conflict doesn't have to be beating people up. It doesn't have to be a war. It doesn't have to be even antagonists. Conflict can come from internal, your friends don't want you to do the thing you want to do. But conflict drives story. And so if you're making a game, when you think, what are people doing in my game? A good way to help define that is, what is the major conflict in my game? Your game should have a conflict. Even if that conflict is, we're all monsters in high school, and the conflict is we don't necessarily get along together. Or maybe the conflict is we're trying to hide our monstrous nature from those around us. Or the conflict is, I want to kiss that ghoul over there, but that ghoul is interested in the vampire, and the vampire is not interested in being in a poly relationship, and the ghoul will only kiss me if I can get the vampire to kiss them. And it's a huge conflict because this is hard to do. Okay, so sometimes the conflict isn't about an antagonist, but it's about internal conflicts. But conflict is the way to make the game go. You must build in some kind of conflict. So you don't, again, have to give an explicit, here's what you do in this game, if you create interesting conflicts throughout your setting, because those will define what people do in the game in a way that will tell them, oh, I'm interested in doing this, and so therefore I'm going to go follow this plot thread. I'm going to go follow this story hook that you've built by creating a conflict. So if you don't say, oh, you're supposed to be exploring the socio-political ramifications of magic use in this game, okay, but then if you create conflicts throughout the setting that essentially the only way to solve them are to explore the socio-political ramifications of having magic, then your setting implies what the players are supposed to do, and it gives them conflicts to solve. If you don't give conflict, if you don't build that in, your players will have a hard time with the game. You will find that it is hard to run the game. There's a lot of cognitive load on the game runner when you don't build a conflict into the game. And you may get some odd feedback from players and game runners. Some people love it because some people can have fun regardless, and some people find it hard to interact with. And I said I will probably be talking about Blades in the Dark a lot, and this is a great place where I can kind of mention that as much as I will give accolades to Blades in the Dark about being a game that knows exactly what it wants you to do, run heists, sometimes it actually falters in this solving a conflict situation in which it gives a lot of freedom to players to provide the drive of what do you do next. But sometimes the players aren't the best at deciding what to do next, even when there's clear goals or clear ability to move forward on a plot or a hook that the storyteller GM has given them. Players will trip over that decision paralysis of, you could literally do anything. What would you like to do tonight? So when you're designing setting, Yes, Blades of the Dark is a bit about getting trauma as fast as possible, but also that's not what the game is about. Uh, but it does reward you for doing that, and so maybe that is what the game is about. We'll talk about that a little bit next week in mechanics, but I will just say that if you design a mechanic into your game that rewards a certain behavior, you're telling the players that that is what your game is about. Mechanics really reinforce setting and activity by giving your players a reward for action. And again, we'll talk about that all next week, but it's a very good point. So you're setting. So when you're building a setting, when you're designing based on setting, when you're creating your lore and your history, or not creating those things, you really need to consider a couple of things that are pretty important. Maybe before you even start. One of the things that you should consider is who is the audience for this game, and when I say that, it really depends on what you're doing. If you're making a homebrew game that you're only ever going to show your friends and you're never going to try to sell it or anything, then the audience for your game are those specific people. But if you're trying to make a game that is completely new to you, you're trying to build something, you want to put it on Kickstarter, you want to get a publisher to buy it from you, you should really think about who your audience is. And when I say that, I'm not trying to tell you to go do market research, but maybe go do market research. But think about the idea of, if you're writing a fantasy game, who is interested in fantasy settings? Who are those people? And if that question, isn't people who play D&D, okay, is there a market already for fantasy games? Yes, there is. Is that market saturated? It might be. How do you make your game stand out from the rest? If you don't ask those questions, if you're like, I'm just going to make a fantasy game, then you're not necessarily going to find purchase for it because people aren't going to be interested in it. Or people are going to be like, well, if I want to play a fantasy game, I already have these 10 options. Well, if you're going to do a sci-fi game, then what's out there already for sci-fi games? There are several that come to mind. Is that market saturated at this point? I don't know. Maybe it is. How is your game going to be different from Aeon or The Expanse or Eclipse Phase or Star Trek or any of the other sci-fi games that are out there? So you should think about, is there a market for what I'm trying to do? And it's okay to make a game that looks a lot like somebody else's game. Like, that's perfectly fine. But consider that you should keep in mind that you're doing that and plan for that, and plan for either leaning into those expectations and playing on those tropes, or pushing against those expectations and making something unique and novel. The other thing to keep in mind, if you're like, oh, I'm going to make a game that nobody's ever heard of before and had no idea that they wanted, but it's going to be amazing, that your idea may be too niche. You may not have any kind of audience for your game because it's something weird that whenever you describe it, people are like, I'm not sure I'd want to play a game about, I can't even think of it. I would love to give a off the cuff example, but I can't. Like, I would love to. I was going to say I'd love to have a game about eating square pieces of watermelon, but I'm sure somebody out there is like, yeah, Danielle, make that game. So just not. So, when you're keeping this in mind, like all this, do your research, read other games, read other things within your genre, read books, read what other people are doing, see how other people are doing games that are similar to what you want to do. Let those people inspire you. I'll talk a lot about in the mechanics part of this seminar about stealing mechanics. Don't steal people's settings. Don't do that. Be inspired by them, but don't steal other people's ideas. Collaborate, listen, get inspired, do not steal. Yes, if your game is too niche, make it a board game. So I'm going to give some examples. I've got 3 examples of games and their settings and how they kind of think about design. And they're all the Trinity Continuum games, because I think the Trinity Continuum games run a gamut of the things I've talked about. And I think it's kind of interesting that it does. So the Trinity Continuum core rulebook is a competence porn game. You're playing talents. They are better than the average person. The setting is implied. You're told that the setting is a modern day setting. You're given some character options that help define the setting in allegiances, and you're given abilities that help define what the setting looks like. But otherwise, there's not a bunch of lore about the world. There's not in the core book. There's a little bit in those character options, but really the implied setting is it looks a lot like our world, only a little brighter and a little more hopeful. And then the what you do in this game is based a lot on how you want to run it. We put a lot of effort into giving you ways to create games and setting ideas, from hunting down bad guys to recovering artifacts to, essentially being leverage, like doing investigation, all of these kind of games you can run. And then we created a scenario book that has 4 different scenarios in it that give you ideas of how to run this game in different ways. But on the inside, and every time you run this game in any way you run it, it will be what I call competence porn, where your characters are highly competent, more competent than anyone else, and they're almost always going to succeed at the things they try to do. Then when we move to Trinity Continuum Anne is a far future game. It has a ton of setting and lore. This game grabs all of the world elements, thinks about what they will look like 200 years in the future, and then gives an extensive setting and lore and information on what the world looks like. It introduces aliens, it introduces life off of Earth, at the moon, on Mars, outer planets. There's so much setting, and in that setting, we define all the conflicts of the game. All of this is what's going on the moon. This is what's going on in Nippon. This is what's going on in the FSA. These are all the conflicts. And if you are playing a game in this area, this is the kind of game you're going to play, because this is the conflict that is happening around you. So one of the things that Anne does well is says, okay, here you're playing scions, so you're still better than humans. You have psionic abilities, and you belong to these different groups who, gave you these psionic abilities, hopefully. And then that's kind of the kind of character you play, but really the setting defines the conflicts of what's going on in the world and how your scions fit into that. And so Anne is one of these very setting heavy and lore heavy games that uses the setting to define the conflict in the game. Yes. Aberrant, which is set in the near future, is a game about superheroes. The superhero game, a lot of superhero games kind of make an assumption that you know what you're going to do with superheroes. You're going to fight bad guys, right? That's the superhero genre is about fighting bad guys and about helping the little guy and using your superpowers to save the day. And so, a lot of superhero assumptions are already kind of being played upon in Aberrant. But the setting for Aberrant helps define that there is a different way that Aberrant is approaching superhero stories. And it is And it specifically does so by introducing this element of celebrity and gives reason for your characters to be interacting with how to deal with the onus of celebrity. It also gives this, mechanically gives this struggle to maintain humanity as you become increasingly more powerful and the concerns of humanity become more trivial to you in the wake of saving the world, saving the universe. So it takes that trope of superheroes are saving the day, they're saving the world, they're fighting the bad guys, and it implies this additional struggle that comes with becoming bigger than all of it. It's becoming so big that your concerns are outside of this world and outside of the concerns of regular, normal people. And so while it shares a setting very close to the Trinity Continuum's core rule book, even just 10 years out from it, the setting gets a little darker. And by darker, I want to say it's not that there isn't hope, but it's more that there's a lot of, the themes of Trinity Continuum in general are hope, sacrifice, and unity. And the core / adventure is hope, aberrant is sacrifice, and then Aeon is unity in a very broad like sense. I'm sure Ian will come crashing through my window like the Kool-Aid Man in 5 minutes to tell me how wrong I am. But that's okay because he's not here. Anyway, so Aberrant uses both its setting to tell you, hey, it's a superhero game. There's this celebrity element that you're going to be playing with. There's, there are novas who do bad things, but it also uses its mechanics to imply some of the things you're going to be doing, such as struggling with your humanity. And finally, adventure. Adventure is a historical setting, and it's based on the pulp stories of that time period. And so it literally gives you instructions. This is what this game is about. Adventure is about being big damn heroes and saving the day. Period. Actually, exclamation point. There's some implicit conflict throughout the world to engage with, but the setting is very, very close to our world setting, dialed up to there are people with superpowers. So yes, there are death rays and balloons. There's also, weird rifts in reality and talking gorillas and talking octopi. But on the box it says you're going to play a big damn hero, and also we're going to imply a bunch of conflict throughout the setting for you to engage in while you're playing this big hero. Okay, so some tips about designing setting and using design. Yes, he's not a gorilla, he's a scientist, but he's also a gorilla. So some tips on designing using setting. And one of the things that you need to do is, again, when you're thinking about your setting, don't overthink it. Don't get so in the weeds that you've spent 5 years defining all the minutiae of your setting without ever getting around to designing the game itself. Also, don't get so involved in the setting that you forget that there needs to be actionable things right now. If you're defining what happened 1,000 years ago in your game world, that needs to be actionable material. If it happened 1,000 years ago, I do kind of want to know about it, but I don't need to know about it unless it somehow relates to something going on right now. If it's important to know how we got here so that you know where to go, that's okay. But long, deep histories are only interesting if people can tie into it somehow. Now, if it's, oh, my character, was born of the Shard War, then like, cool, tell us about the Shard War so that characters can be involved in that. But if the Shard War happened 1,000 years ago and the result of it was no one even remembers the Shard War, like, and nobody talks about the Shard War, then knowing about it is not useful. And writing about it is maybe not worth your time. So that gets us into thinking about something I didn't really talk about yet. And I think, now I am going to, because I'm kind of getting into the tips part of this, is anytime you're going to design anything, always consider making an outline first and make a plan for what you're going to do. This is relating back to, my husband is a software engineer and he talks about program management. And he gave me some ideas about this. I was like explaining, I've got this breakdown. And he was like, have you looked at like the software design lifecycle? And I was like, no, I don't know what that is. And it was like, oh yeah, here it is. And it's like, here, plan and set requirements. And I was like, oh yes, write an outline. And then it was, go through and decide what kind of, software you're going to use. And I'm like, oh yes, design what kind of mechanics, or like decide what kind of mechanics you want. And then it was write, build the code. And I'm like, okay, yeah, write the book. And then it was, do some testing. And I'm like, yep, okay, we're going to play test. And it was like, oh, do some validation. And I'm like, oh, okay, so, make sure that the game is doing what you originally said it was going to do. And then, verify. And I'm like, oh, make sure that, the people that you're doing the thing that people understand. And when they play it, they're getting out of it what you thought you were getting out of it. And then, and then release it in the world. And I'm like, oh yes, Kickstarter. So anyway, I would always start with a plan. I have started things without a plan and I never finished them. I have started things with a plan and I have finished them. I'm not telling you that everything that starts without a plan won't get finished, but the most efficient way to get something finished is to start with a plan. That way you're not going to have to scrap it and start over 5 times. So, do that. Also, during the setting phase, while you're making the setting, when you write the setting, when you're thinking about the setting, get some outside input. Make sure your setting is representative. And I say representative, I don't actually like the term inclusive. I mean, yes, be inclusive, but I feel like inclusive makes it sounds like you're making space for something that wouldn't otherwise be there, when really you just need to represent things that exist in the world. So representation matters, but also keep in mind that if you're writing about marginalized folks, that you're not a part of that group, absolutely write about them, but don't write about their marginalization. You can represent them, but you can't really talk about marginalization unless you have been experienced that marginalization yourself. So if I want to write about the repression of women in the workplace, or if I want to write about bisexual erasure, yes, because I've experienced those things. But if I want to write about racism, I'm not going to be the best person to do that, and I really shouldn't be. I should find somebody who's experienced racism to write that for me. I can write about Black people and people of color all I want, but having them experience racism is not something I should write about. Represent people and also get people to sensitivity read for you. Make sure that you're representing them accurately and you're not creating some kind of awful stereotype in your representation. Those sound like really big onuses, but honestly, like, hey, friend, who is this thing? Can you read this real quick to make sure I'm not like kicking myself, like being really bad about what I'm doing? Also, know what your tropes are and avoid stereotypes is really easy because there's all sorts of literature about it online. There's so much written about bad stereotypes and bad representation that you should be able to avoid the big things really easily. And then you get a sensitivity reader for the things that maybe you wouldn't have been able to find in these bigger, broader searches. When I say know the history of tropes, but keep that in mind because sometimes you want to know tropes in general, because sometimes tropes are there for a reason and because they work. There are genre-defining tropes. Science fiction genre-defining tropes is that technology is often, like technology and sci-fi is often a stand-in for people's hubris. And going too far in technology brings some kind of, I don't want to say downfall, but it is some way to deal with a problem in an interesting way, or or the technology itself represents some kind of hubristic element. So it's okay to lean into that kind of trope. But it's maybe not okay to lean into the tropes of everyone from this civilization is evil. Or all the women in this society are wives and childbearers and do not work and are not allowed to have jobs. You can also know those tropes and try to challenge ones that are outdated but can be fun when they're turned around. So if you're used to seeing tropes about, the two main protagonists or the protagonists of this story, so maybe a setting element is this person is a protagonist and they're a straight person. Turn that into a queer story. Turn white stories into people of color stories. Make damsels in distress into sword-wielding badasses. Challenge those tropes, turn them around, and they suddenly become cool and fun. Just send the ones that completely suck out the window, though, because that's no fun. At least not for me. I'm tired of certain tropes in media and in games. And as long as everybody threw them out, I'd probably be happy. Don't be afraid. I'm going to say this, and everybody's going to be like, Danielle, what? Don't be afraid to just throw it all out the window and start over. Don't be afraid to scratch out everything you've already written and change it to something new. Don't be afraid to change gears. Don't be afraid to reinvent what you've already started on. Do not be afraid. It is not a sunk cost. You have not wasted time by putting words onto paper. You have not wasted time by creating a setting that you never use. What you have done is you have practiced. Okay? Every time you write something down, every time you make a new setting element, even if you throw it out, even if you never use it, you have practiced. You have honed what it will eventually become something hopefully really awesome that people enjoy. So don't be afraid to just be like, nope, that's not working. Turn around and start over. And then my last tip is outline your thoughts before getting started, because of course I put at the very end of my long outline of my thoughts. So we have another, I'd say like 10 to 15 minutes before I'm done with this thing. And so what I would like to do, if everybody is up for it, is to spend a little bit of time making a setting. Or coming up with some setting design ideas with everybody who's watching. So if you're interested in this, please start throwing out some answers to what kind of game is this. And I am going to switch us over to a workshop. All right. I've got spooky kissing ghosts. That's the genre, spooky kissing ghosts. All right, I have all right, spooky kissing ghosts. Okay, coming to terms feelings about a bad thing in the past. Okay, I'm just gonna dads on tractors. All right. Amazing. Okay, let's all right. We've got 4 ideas here of you know what is this game gonna be. So do we have votes on spooky kissy ghosts, coming to terms with your feelings about a bad thing from the past, complications with immortality, dads on tractors, the homoerotic alternative to kids on bikes, with seething dad on dad action? I'm not gonna veto that, but I'm gonna say that if we're gonna do that, that's gonna get silly real fast. So these are all the same game. So let's make this all the same game. All right. So this is the genre. You are ghosts who are dads, like farming dads, the ghosts of farming dads who are in love with each other. They are dealing with their newfound immortality as a ghost. But they died in a way where they had unresolved issues, and they are working with each other to resolve their issues. This is the game, okay? So this is the game. Ghost dads from the 1930s Dust Bowl have died with unresolved issues. They seek each other out to confront they seek each other out to confront these feelings and to cope with their newfound immortality. Okay, so this is what our setting is. This is kind of what our game is. So are players doing at the table? Are they talking their feelings out with each other? What? Oh. Yeah. I'm okay with it being set in the present. In fact, you can do it at any time point. They just died during the Dust Bowl because they were farmers, and they've watched their family grow up and get old and die, and that's part of this immortality that they're trying to come to terms with. So actions and games are through. So this is an epistolary game, is what I'm hearing, where we write each other letters, ghostly letters on Dear John, or on John Deere's. I don't know. So what do we do at the table? What are players doing in this game? Dear John Deere is now the name of this game that we are making. Title. So, so again, when we come up with this, what are we doing? What are the players doing at the table? Actions involving vices, perhaps as avoidance behaviors. What do you mean by that? So when you say actions involving vices as avoidance behavior, I want to know what you mean by this thing. Or anyone else. What do we do at the table? See, it's so great to have a funny idea, but we need to know. All right. Look for clues of what happened to your buddies, and you have to be really messy. Part of how do you confront someone who is your gay ghost buddy, because they could go real sideways if you're wrong. Okay. All right. I like this. Attend to mundane life. I'm looking for clues. Okay, let me see. Attend to mundane life. Look for clues. Okay. So, in this game, players take on the role of ghostly dads who must seek out answers to their lost livelihoods and seek out a way to resolve past issues. They do this by interacting with other ghost dads. They try to live mundane lives, but are thrown into extraordinary circumstances on the regular, which puts these dads into compromising situations in which they must struggle not to kiss each other, because that would certainly spell doom. Doom? No. I think, why are they trying not to make out? Oh, they play Pinnacle. Is that the mechanics of this game? Later we will define the mechanics of this game. So I'm going to make a note, mechanics. I can spell. Play Pinnacle. No. That's a damn it. Okay. Yeah. How about, they must struggle not to kiss each other because that would destroy their families. Spoiler. It's hard to resist. And they kiss a lot. All right. So this is Dear John Deere. Yeah, I don't think anything actually happens to their families. They just feel a lot of Catholic guilt about it. and maybe there's like a guilt meter eventually that we can build into the mechanics of like guilt versus I don't want to call it reconciliation, but essentially like that feeling of reconciling the past deeds, and you actually reconcile those past deeds by kissing, but you try not to because of all this guilt you have built up. Yes, acceptance. Yes, guilt versus acceptance. Thank you. All right. I think because they're struggling with their immortality, they're not getting closure. They're getting acceptance. They're just accepting the things they couldn't resolve because they're never actually going to be able to resolve those past issues. Those things are for the living. Now they must reconcile what they're doing here in the afterlife. Oh, I love, yes, guilt affects their self-image and affects their appearance. Yes. Fantastic. So we're pretty much at time. I'm going to be holding on to this document next week when we do mechanics. We will revisit Dear John Deere, and we will build some mechanical thoughts for our ghost dad making out game that is maybe an epistolary game. So thank you everybody for listening. Thank you everybody for engaging. I hope to see you all next week. And I guess, have a good night and everything. And I will see you all next week. All right. Bye everybody. Thank you.